Value, price, and consumer surplus. So we finished talking about marginal benefit and marginal cost, and we see that value is the value that the consumer ascribes to a product or a service. In other words, how much you're willing to pay for something really means how much are you willing to give up of something else to get that product. So that is the value. Price is actually how much you pay for it. So we have a new concept that we're introducing, which is called consumer surplus. So here we have the situation of our demand curve with our ice cream cones, and we can see that the price of the ice cream cone was $3 and 6 ice cream cones are purchased. Okay. Now recall that the demand curve represents the marginal benefit curve. The people who are willing to buy 1 ice cream cone at $5.50 or 2 ice cream cones at $5, they don't have to pay that price because they get to pay the equilibrium price. And therefore, they get what we call consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good and what the consumer actually pays. Okay, so basically it's like this. You go to the mall, you're planning on buying a pair of jeans. Maybe you've put $40 aside to buy a pair of jeans, and you get to the mall and all the jeans are on sale for $25. Wow, so you were willing to pay $40. That's how much you valued it. But when you got there, you found them for $25. So you had $15 extra of what we call consumer surplus. Extra value that you got because you were in a free market and you got to purchase the product at a price that is less than what you were willing to pay. So that's consumer surplus. So we track individual consumer surplus. Everybody's value for a product is going to be dependent upon however it is that they value a product. So if, for instance, Michael here was willing to pay $6 for ice cream, but the actual price was $3, Michael would get 6 minus 3 would get $3 worth of consumer surplus. Laura, willing to pay $5, but only had to pay $3, the equilibrium price. So 5 minus 3 gives Laura $2 of consumer surplus. Sandy was willing to pay $4 and the price was $3, so she got $1 of consumer surplus. And Lydia, willing to pay $3, she gets to the ice cream shop and that's exactly what she pays, $3. So she doesn't really get any extra value or consumer surplus. What about Jerry? Jerry was only willing to pay $2. The actual price is $3, so he would have a negative consumer surplus. He wouldn't buy the product. Okay, nor would Magda. So this is the case of individual consumer surplus. Now we also have market consumer surplus. The market consumer surplus is as follows. This yellow square with our ice cream again, we have 6 units of ice cream at $3. This is how much is actually going to get paid by the buyer. This triangle up here is the value that they get, but they didn't have to pay for this because they paid the equilibrium price of $3. Okay, so you have the consumer surplus, which is the triangle, which is below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. Okay. And then you have the amount paid, which is in this yellow rectangle or square. So how do we find consumer surplus when we're talking about a market? So this is the shape of a triangle. So now we have to go back to our math. What is the area formula for the area of a triangle? So the formula for the area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2. The origin to 6. Okay, except that it's going to be up here on the triangle. So the 6 units is the base, And the height of this triangle is 6 minus 3, and that gives us the height. So 6 times 3 is 18, divided by 2 is 9. The value of this entire triangle is $9. The consumer actually paid $3 times 6 ice cream cones. That's $18. So the consumer paid $18. That's the area of this yellow square, but got extra value above and beyond that yellow square in the form of consumer surplus, okay, which was 6 minus 3 is 3 times the base of 6. That's 18. We have a triangle. It's going to divide that in half. They got $9 of extra value. So this is what we call consumer surplus. Okay, so you might ask, well, what about the producer? Cost price producer surplus. As we talked about in our last section, we discussed marginal cost and how the supply curve is the marginal cost curve for the firm. Producer surplus equals the price that a firm sells a product for minus the marginal cost of producing that good. So producer surplus is going to be the area that is underneath the price, but above the supply curve. So this shaded area here is the producer surplus for a firm. When we look at producer surplus for a firm, we can calculate this on an individual level. So we can see that here we have Janet, who is, Janet, who is willing to produce the ice cream for $1, but the actual equilibrium price is $3. So what that means is that Janet actually gets producer surplus. She gets some extra value. So we're going to find that by taking the price minus the minimum acceptable price to her, which is her marginal cost. So 3 minus 1 gives us $2 worth of producer surplus. Larry is willing to produce ice cream at $2, and he can sell it for $3. So he's getting producer surplus of $1. Kevin will sell ice cream for $3. That's his marginal cost. And he's getting $3. So Kevin gets 0 producer surplus, but he does get his cost recovered when he makes the ice cream. Cindy, Dan, and Ed all have negative producer surplus, which means that they are not going to be producing the ice cream. Their marginal cost is higher than the price that is being, the ice cream is being sold for in the market. Okay, so how do we find producer surplus for a market? We are going to do it in the same fashion that we solved for consumer surplus. Now, the equilibrium price is $3 and 6 units are being sold. So the firm is getting, in terms of revenue, sales from the consumer, 3 times 6, a total of $18. But this yellow area right here is the firm's cost to produce, okay, all of this yellow area. The producer surplus, which is the extra value to the producer because they are in a free market and selling at this market price, is the area of this blue triangle. So we're going to solve for this exactly the same way we did for consumer surplus. We're going to take the base of the triangle times the height. Now you might say, wait a minute, what's the base? The triangle's upside down. Well, just think about turning it around, turning it up on the correct side. So the base of the triangle is going to be from 0 to 6, except it's up here, 0 to 6. So the base is 6. The height of the triangle is 3 minus 0. Remember that 0 is at the origin. So we're going to have the base of 6 times the height of 3 gives us 18, divided by 2 gives us producer surplus of $9. So we know already that allocative efficiency occurs where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and that's how we determine where our resources are being used the most efficiently. But we also know that when marginal cost equals marginal benefit, we are maximizing our total economic surplus. So economic surplus or total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Together, these two are our total surplus. To summarize, consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good and the price that the consumer actually has to pay. Producer surplus is the difference between the price that a seller can get in the market and that seller's marginal cost. When you add consumer surplus and producer surplus together, we have what is called total surplus. You might also hear it referred to as economic surplus. And these become, again, valuable concepts when we start to look at inefficient markets. The efficient use of resources, we say, occurs at the intersection of the marginal benefit and marginal cost curves. We get maximum total surplus when we have an efficient allocation of resources. Here we have a supply and demand curve, and we have triangles A, B, C, and D. The questions are going to ask you to correctly identify some of the concepts that we discussed. So the first question says, which triangle represents consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the area underneath the demand curve and above the market price. So triangle A would represent consumer surplus. The next question says, which triangle represents the amount of spending the consumers would be paying for the product? So we know that where supply equals demand, that is going to set our equilibrium price. And where supply equals demand, that sets the equilibrium quantity. That means that this is how many units are being bought and at what price. So the two triangles that represent the amount that is being spent, actual cash leaving the consumer's pocket, is triangle B and triangle C. So price times quantity tells us how much spending is actually occurring. Now the third question asks you, what is the total maximum amount that consumers would have been willing to pay for the product? Which triangles capture total consumer willingness to pay? So that would be what they actually paid, B and C. And they would have paid A because remember that consumer surplus is what consumers are willing to pay minus the price paid. So in this case, triangles A, B, and C would demonstrate the amount that consumers are willing to pay. Let's look at another chart. This one's more confusing. Okay, so you have to be more analytical here. So it says, refer to the provided graph of a competitive market. If the output level is Q1, then there are efficiency losses indicated by the area, and then you have to figure out which area. So we know that point C is the efficient output and the allocatively efficient price. So that would be Q2. But the question says, if output is at Q1, there are efficiency losses. So if output is at Q1, supply is at point E, and demand is at point B. So that means that we have our marginal benefit greater than our marginal cost. This area represents an efficiency loss. Okay, so if the output level is Q1, then there are efficiency losses indicated by the area of triangle B, C, and E. Okay. Second part of the question says, refer to the provided graph of a competitive market. If the output level is Q1, then the sum of the consumer and producer surplus is what? So if it's Q1 plus, and this amount is producer surplus. So if the output level is Q1, then the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is points A, D, 0, E, and B. So this is the total sum of consumer and producer surplus. Important to note that we also have another concept, which is this area here, this whole triangle. And this triangle here is what we call a deadweight loss. It's considered a deadweight loss. Here is another diagram. The area that identifies the maximum sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is, so now you have to identify which area that is. So you already know from our studies that the maximum sum is going to occur where we are at allocative efficiency. And at allocative efficiency, our price is P1 and output is Q2. So the area that defines the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is going to be A, B, C, and D. This whole triangle is the maximum sum of producer and consumer surplus if actual production occurs at Q2. Now, what happens if production occurs at Q3? Well, if we're looking at Q3, are we overproducing or underproducing? In this case, marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. And so we are overproducing, and this is inefficient. So if we refer to the diagram, if actual production and consumption occur at Q3, we're going to have an efficiency loss equal to triangle E and triangle F. So that would be our deadweight loss. Just as in the previous question, all of this becomes deadweight loss. The next question says, which of the following areas best represents the efficiency loss from underproduction? And that would be B and D. If we're underproducing, marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. And we are underproducing. So triangles B and D. I hope this helps. Be sure to ask me questions.